We'll get started now. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Creating Cultural Safety in the Workplace and Elevating First Nations Experiences. This has been a webinar that has been on our minds for a long time. We've got a very active and incredible First Nations employee network who have also given us a lot of time and resources and energy and grace and expertise that have all gone into today's webinar. And I will be co-presenting with one of the members of the Community Legal Centres Queensland First Nations Reference Group, Andrea Carl-Saylor. I'll introduce her in a moment. To start with, my name is Sammy Cooper. I'm one of the capacity building team members at Community Legal Centres Queensland. Before we get started, I'll acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're holding today's webinar on. Down in Meanjin, where we're presenting from in Brisbane, they're the Turrbal and the Yagara people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that these are stolen lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. This webinar is also being presented from Palm Island, and I'll let Indy introduce herself in a moment. But it is also being viewed by people across Queensland and actually across Australia today. So I pay my respect to the traditional owners throughout the country and, of course, extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people who are listening on the call today. I will introduce myself formally. I'm Samantha Cooper. I'm a Gumbaynggirr woman from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. I am a capacity building team member at the Community Legal Centres Queensland team, but probably most importantly, actually, I'm also presenting today with Andrea Carl-Saylor. Andrea is very gratefully a member of our First Nations reference group here at Community Legal Centres Queensland, helping to guide the work that we do internally and externally. An incredible woman and a beautiful friend of mine. She's a proud Berrigubba woman. She's a traditional owner of the Whitsundays in the Bowen area. And she's also a proud Brookerman woman, a historical owner of Palm Island, and is based on Palm Island. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody listening?
Yes, what a Molly. Good morning. I apologise, this is my first webinar, so I hope everybody could hear me and can understand me. I'd like to thank Sammy for the opportunity today as well. I'd also like to thank the elders past and present for their guidance and instilling in me my culture and my strong beliefs that I hold today, and their continued passing down of their knowledge to me. I learn every day. I too acknowledge the struggles and the strengths of our people and am proud to be a First Nations woman. Sovereignty was never ceded, always was and always will be. I'm presently sitting on Palm Island. The weather is absolutely beautiful here. I'm working as a community development worker, cultural advisor with First Nations Women's Legal Service, and I have done so for the past 8 years. I work part-time and I certainly enjoy the challenges we face every day in this arena. Thank you, Sammy.
Thank you. There is a little bit of housekeeping that we'll get through. Like I said, the webinar is being recorded. It'll be available by the end of the year. End of the week, end of the year as well, though. Questions, if you type your questions or comments into the question box, they will be addressed at the end, and I will do the best that I can to monitor it as we go. If you do need technical help, you can email me and I'll do the best that I can to get back to you. But like I said, it will be available later on. Keep safe note, Community Legal Centres Queensland wants to make sure that people accessing these training materials feel safe and are able to access appropriate and timely help and support. We do have a keep safe slide here. If at any time you do feel like you would like to step away, please feel free. You don't need to notify us, obviously, or anything, but there's also some more information of free and confidential organisations listed on our Keep Safe website, which is below. This is my formal acknowledgement. Andy just did a beautiful one. Like I said, I'm a Gumbaynggirr woman, and I pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also really like to pause, I guess, and reflect back my deep love and appreciation for people back home, and particularly the matriarchs in my family who have held our community together for tens of thousands of years. And at home, they're the drivers of language revival, of cultural protection, and the establishment of an Aboriginal immersive school. down in the Botanic Gardens down in Coffs, where kids are all learning language as well as English. And that's one of the most remarkable things and one of the things that I'm most proud of as a Gumbaynggirr woman. I extend that appreciation to the knowledge and expertise among us today. I acknowledge the struggles and the strengths of our people and reflect Andy's comment, the sovereignty was never ceded. It always was and always will be. So today, I guess we're going to have a bit of yarn. It'll be structured but fairly informal, which I guess is how we roll a fair bit.
Yeah.
Particularly around cultural safety, there's a lot of information about what cultural safety can be defined as and the ways that people conceptualize it. And the gap that we are trying to help to fill a little bit here is what is the journey of cultural safety in terms of the practical steps and things that you can implement into your organisation to build the cultural safety and the cultural capacity of the organisation and the cultural intelligence. And we won't be able to cover everything in an hour. I think we could run one a week for 5 years and we still wouldn't be able to cover everything. But hopefully what we can do is to give you a starting point and a little bit of information about what the practical steps can look like. And it's also really important that both Andy and I had yarn about this yesterday, that we acknowledge that the stories that we tell and the stories that we hold, the information that we give today has been passed down to us through hundreds and thousands of people and stories and generations, and people like Auntie Flo have been absolute pioneers in this space. And so the knowledge that we share is not just our knowledge and our experience, but particularly for the community legal centres in Queensland, we've got a really strong First Nations employee network of about 70 people who have all shared their stories and yarns. And so I really want to pay respect and thanks to them and just acknowledge that this webinar today has hundreds of voices and hundreds of stories threaded throughout it. So I'm very grateful to Andy for jumping on, and we just want to make sure that we make that really clear, is that this is going to be a really good yarn, and it will be full of lots of detailed information and lots of high-level information mixed through. So hold your questions to the end. We'll do our best to answer if we can, but we can also come back to you if we can't. So the first three pillars, I guess, we're going to go through now are what the journey of cultural safety is, where are we going, how do we know we're there, and what does success look like? And if we don't get really clear on those things, it can be incredibly difficult for organisations to know whether or not they're on track, to figure out whether or not they're doing the right things. And there's lots of people with a great heart for the work who just don't quite know where to start or don't quite know where they fit in terms of making practical steps. So it's really important that we get clear on your why. And where are you going? Have a plan. Have a really detailed plan, excuse me, about what success looks like. Are you measuring your progress? Are you evaluating your impact? Do you know that your workers and your clients feel culturally safe? And if you do, how do you know? How do you check back? How do you reflect on that? Do they feel valued and safe and respected? And what is your impact? So if you don't know where you're going, you don't know whether or not you're there, and you don't know what success looks like, I can completely understand why that would be really quite an overwhelming journey. So we're really going to dig into this a little bit based on those three things, and there'll be a few other pillars that we can thread throughout. So, Andy, did you want to add anything to that piece?
No, not at the moment. But it's, yeah, like you're saying, we need to be quite clear where we're going and what it looks like. So, yeah, no, Sammy.
Absolutely. So we'll start where cultural safety is, and I'm not going to go on too much about it other than to say we've really intentionally included what cultural safety is, and we have not included what cultural safety is not. This has been taken from conversations that at Community Legal Centres Queensland, Penny Sullivan and I have had with more than 50 employees and organisations of community-controlled organisations and First Nations employees in the sector about what cultural safety is and what it includes. So it includes belonging and psychosocial safety, representation and visibility, inclusion at all levels. People want to feel welcomed and valued. They want to feel respect and recognition. It's about equity and not equality. It's about real diversity, consultation and engagement, genuine co-design and collaboration, and recognising that they are not the same. Embedding principles of self-determination, and it's also got a lot to do with power. And the reason that we exclude conversations about what cultural safety is not is because we can have the most incredible and detailed and really comprehensive plan on how we're going to implement an anti-racism framework, for example, or anti-racism training for everybody, but a lack of racism does not equal cultural safety. So a lack of something does not equal cultural safety. A lack of bullying and a lack of exclusion does not automatically make somebody feel culturally safe. And so we're trying to really clearly make that distinction about what it is and how you positively implement it, rather than looking at, if I remove racism, I'm culturally safe, because that's just not the way that it goes in organisations in particular. And so what are the actions around those things? How do we know where we're going? How do we implement cultural safety? And for us, we've taken this at a really high level at Community Legal Service Queensland about how do we get positive steps that leaders and organisations and people who work on the ground can implement into their organisations about how we do this. How do we actually create cultural safety? And it's about mandating support for employees. It's about implementing cultural supervision, mentoring, culturally safe psychological supports. It's about upskilling your First Nations employees, but about upskilling your entire workforce. So mandating support for your employees is critical here. And the difference between I have an open door policy and I have structured supports put in place for my First Nations employees is vast. They are at completely different ends of the spectrum. And so by mandating support, you don't have to tell people how they access this support or how support looks for them or what it looks like for them, but we do need to mandate putting it in place. Cultural supervision is one of the most critical pieces for that in my experience, and that doesn't need to look like sitting down with your manager or your line manager and talking about what's on your plate. It's actually completely different. In a similar concept to the way that social workers use supervision, cultural supervision can be anybody that your employee chooses. And they can debrief with them, they can sit down, they can speak about what's happening in their organisation and what's happening in their roles, and they don't have to explain the cultural context, which often means they get to leave that really heavy cultural load at the door for this conversation. And that's a really important part of supporting your employees, is giving them space and time to be able to bring their whole selves to a conversation without having to filter it, and also without having to apply definitions and context to the conversation, because that makes it an additional load rather than removing the load, which is what we're actively trying to do. The second one we're going to talk about is ongoing training. One of the things we hear lots in organisations is about whether or not you could do annual cultural safety training and what that looks like, and how do we make sure that all of our employees are able to access that training. Obviously, it's a really critical part of what's happening. But the other thing that we really need to be mindful of is that it needs to be ongoing. It needs to be a journey for all of your employees from 101, what is cultural safety for people who have never been exposed to this work before. And it needs to continue along a timeline here of what sophistication looks like. So where do we go from 101 to embedding it in service delivery, to making sure that it's in our governance, to making sure that people are continually able to grow and learn in this work, because it's important even as First Nations employees, and I'm sure Indy will say the same, there is at no point could I ever say that I know everything, even having grown up as an Aboriginal kid. So I was really lucky to have grown up with lots of really beautiful, strong culture and continue to be surrounded by amazing people, but there is no way that I will ever have stopped learning. So this ongoing training for your organisation is a really critical piece as well. And Andy, you were saying the other day that it's really important that we ensure that members of staff undertake the cultural training offered so that it's not an opt-in or an opt-out. Do you want to expand on that?
Sorry, you just cut out there, Sammy. Sorry.
No, that's all right. We were saying the other day it's really important that members of staff undertake the cultural training that's offered so that it's not an opt-in or an opt-out training, and so that if you do have First Nations staff in your organisation, they don't see people opting out of doing the training, because I guess the other issue here is if we've got an opt-in version of cultural awareness training, there's lots of different types of awareness training that's going on down in Brisbane. We've got Uncle Tom Kirk, who does lots of training. There's lots of really great online versions, so it doesn't need to be the same every year, but it does need to be an ongoing journey. It does need to be something that's embedded from your induction of training of staff. If they're doing policies and procedures, then they should be doing cultural safety training as part of their induction as well.
Yeah, that's right. And it's important because each of the different areas where we live, the protocols for First Nations people are a little bit different in those areas. So you need to be given that training to show the specifics for that area. That gives you more understanding. Oh, okay, that's why you do it. Oh, that's how come you do it. You need that, and it's not just a tick and flick that, yep, we've done the cultural training. It needs to be worthwhile, and you be clear. And like Sammy said, it must be ongoing too, because things change as well. So yeah, it's important.
Absolutely. And a really good point that you brought up there is this idea around place-based training. So the protocols that are in place for me back home down in Coffs are completely different to the protocols that are in the southeast corner down here, and they are completely different again to Palm Island. So it's important that if you are working in a place-based centre in a place-based way, or if you are going into communities or having contact with people outside of your usual area, that you are acknowledging that there are different ways of working, because we are not one people. There are more than 300 First Nations clans, and when we go up into the Torres Strait, it gets even more diverse again, and really recognising and acknowledging the beauty that is in the two very distinct groups of people, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people's experience historically and in an ongoing way has been completely different. So it's really important that we recognise and honour that, and there's a real beauty in that. The next one we'll talk about is policies and procedures, and it seems to me like it should just make sense, and it seems to me like it should just be embedded in our policies and procedures. But the trap there is that if it's just in our policies and it's just written in our procedures and it's not live in our organisations and something that we live and breathe every day, that can be another kind of trap. So if there's nothing in policies and procedures, we fall into an area where there's a risk, if there's a change of staff or a change of management or there's a shift in the organisation in whatever way, if it's not embedded into policies and procedures, we can lose it. And equally, if it is only in policies and procedures and not something that we live and breathe, we can lose it. And it's important that we make sure that there is a First Nations lens across all of our policies and procedures. Sorry, I'm getting over a kindy cold, you'll have to excuse me. And that we don't just have a single standalone policy that says we should treat First Nations people with respect. If you're not including a First Nations lens across all of your policies and all of your procedures, across all of your recruitment and retention practices, then it becomes tokenistic, and that can actually become quite dangerous. The next piece that we'll go into is recruitment and retention. And we're skipping through this a little bit, and of course we can always come back, but I really am keen to just kind of get into this conversation, particularly with Andy, around recruitment and retention and looking at the ways that organisations do this work. And we often get asked, how do we find the right people to recruit? How do we make sure that we're retaining the right staff? We really want to make sure that we're looking after and scaffolding our First Nations staff. And there are certainly ways of being able to target, whether it's through targeted recruitment or identified recruitment or First Nations roles, or putting targets on recruitment and making sure that we're getting First Nations staff across the entire organisation rather than just identifying a whole bunch of trainee roles to meet some kind of target. And there is certainly a balance here that we really need to bring to the light. So one of my bugbears is organisations who say, yeah, we have a target of 5% First Nations employment, and we're sitting at 6%, so we're achieving that and we're doing a really great job. And I say, that's awesome. Where do those staff sit? How many of those staff are managers? How many of those people are not admin? How many of those people are not your frontline staff? How many people do you have in decision-making roles? How many people have you got embedded into your governance structures? How many people are in positions where they feel like they can speak up to power, where they can also feel like they can have influence over the organisation's direction? Because it's one thing to have 6% First Nation staff, that's great, but if you can't keep them and if you're not ensuring their safety, then A, they're not going to stay, and B, you're not putting people into a structured, safe environment, which is really detrimental, not just to the person, but also to the organisation and to the community. And you'll see that in place-based organisations in particular, where the reputation of the organisation is pretty heavily enmeshed with the staff that they recruit, where people trust the organisation because they trust the frontline staff. And it would be the same over on Palm with Andy, who's been there for years and is part of the furniture at First Nations Women's. But people come to the organisation because they trust Andy, because they see her in the community. Andy, do you want to expand a bit on that?
Yeah, that's right. It's really difficult to gain that trust as well, but you will gain it over time. Being a small community, people have trust issues or confidentiality, but we build that trust. Respect the role that we have in our community. Just in relation to something with that recruitment and retention, it's also important that there be succession plans, because I can guarantee you that majority of positions are filled with First Nations in admin roles or non-professional legal roles. So there should be definitely a succession plan or a way up the ladder. You need to grow people as well, and we all learn, continually learning, from our environment, work environment. So it is important to try and encourage our mob too to advance yourself. It's no good going to professional development where you're going to be learning leadership roles and things if your aim isn't to move up the ladder. So, and like you said, we don't want it just to be tokenistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's ways of targeting your recruitment, and things that I have seen done in organisations are removing the reliance on written applications and recognising that there are transferable skills and communication skills that can't be drawn out of really valuable potential employees that can get lost if all you're relying on is what's written on a piece of paper in front of you. And that's not to say ignore all the skills that are required, particularly in our sector. It is undeniable that you need to have legal skills in order to be a lawyer. You know, you need to be qualified. You need to be able to write in a concise way. And that's not to say that in every situation you should just remove that, but it is to say that we need to constantly pause and reflect back and check what our recruitment practices are, check what our where the value lies, and I guess how much value we're placing on each part of the process. Are you putting people in situations where they get time to explore the questions so that they can think through their answers? And that just that doesn't just support First Nations employees, it supports everybody, because this recruitment process can often be quite onerous. And if we're looking at ways that we can support people and we can support First Nations people, it usually will work for everybody, which is the great thing about embedding good practice. Are you relying too heavily on written applications? Are you giving people time to think through the questions? Are you considering where they sit in an interview room? If you ask somebody to sit at the back of the room where they can't get to the door, it might make people feel uncomfortable. There's lots of different levels of trauma that we need to be mindful of for the whole community, but particularly for First Nations peoples. Are you asking somebody to sit with their back to the door where they're in a position where that might not make them feel the most comfortable? And are you asking those questions? Have you asked somebody, where would you like to sit today? So there's ways that we can build in levels of support even into these recruitment practices that are trauma informed and that are mindful of the person sitting in front of you. And I guess what the message that I really want to get across today, one of many, I suppose, is that we really need to make sure that this work is people-centric. And that can often get lost when we start talking about percentages and widgets and, you know, policies and procedures. And the thing that really matters here in this work, and to be able to do this work well, is people. This needs to be people-centric work. You need to have a really clear why across your organisation, but also personally, particularly as leaders, and you need to be really people-centric. And the next pillar in terms of practical actions that you can implement is embedding reporting across the organisation. So this works for organisations of all sizes. We have some really small centres in the community legal sector, and we also have some really large, sophisticated centres with lots of processes in place. And so I guess I'll try and speak to both of them a little bit. In terms of embedding reporting in the organisation, it's something that we've been looking at, particularly as part of the accreditation process with community legal centres and the ways that we support and scaffold those processes. Does your CEO report to the board against performance on your RAP or your First Nations action plan? Do your line managers report up to the CEO in their different levels of reporting, whether that's quarterly, whatever it is that you have in your organisation? But are they being asked to embed strands of your First Nations action plan in your RAP? Are they being given accountability over this RAP or over this plan? And are they reporting against that and the performance against that? And I guess for me, when I walk into an organisation and see that actually this is just a plan sitting on a page and it's in, you know, the OneDrive somewhere, but nobody really knows where, and it's not being reported against, it means to me that this is not a live document. This is not something that's living and breathing in the organisation. And when I ask staff at all levels, do you know what's in your RAP? Or do you know what your role is in implementing the RAP? And they said, no, I haven't seen it since they came and did a workshop to pull it all together 2 years ago. I think at some point we need to stop and ask ourselves why we're doing this. If you're not reporting it in your organisation, why is this in your organisation in the first place? And that is often quite a confronting question. And it needs to be answered in a really strength-based way, not just in terms of reporting across your organisation, but just in general. If the only reason that we get when we ask, why is this work important to you, is because you say, well, because we feel like we should be doing it, then we need to get really clear. We need to stop and pause and get really clear on our why first. And by embedding the reporting in the organisation, it gives accountability to everybody, but it also gives people a chance and an opportunity to be part of this work. because this is absolutely my favourite part of my role, I have to say. I mean, as much as I love our organisation, being able to work with people and with centres and embedding this work is really important. And the easiest way to get a quick gauge on where it's at is by saying, is this embedded? Do you have this embedded into your governance? Do you have culturally safe practices across your organisation, and how are you measuring them and how are you reporting against those? If your goal is to increase your First Nations staff and no one in your organisation is working specifically on strategies to be able to recruit really high quality candidates and to be able to support their existing staff, and there's no strategies or initiatives across your organisation in how to do that, then all we've got is just a wish rather than a plan. And that doesn't work for your employees, and it also doesn't work for embedding this work in a meaningful way. And it means that you're not being able to identify your impact. And it means that we don't quite know what success looks like. And when we started this webinar, we said, where are we going? How do we know we're there? And what does success look like? So if you don't have a plan, if you're not reporting it, if you don't know how close you are, if you don't know what success looks like, then really we need to look at where the energy is being targeted, because this work is not easy. And if it feels hard, it means you're doing it right. This work is so meaningful and it can be so valuable for everybody in your organisation, not just for First Nations people and for First Nations clients and communities. And it's really important that we get clear on embedding it. Hey, Andy.
Yes, that's right. And, you know, there's other ways of embedding the reporting in the organisation too. Yeah, there's through the CEO up to the board. But there's also, you could call quarterly staff meetings with all staff. Then you're going through the support for employees, checking, making sure, because we can get tied up and busy. We're all frontline workers. We're just flat chat. We tend to forget that we are people as well. And then we can check, okay, is there any ongoing training do we need? You know, how are the policies and procedures working? Like you said, you know, we need that First Nations lens across the policies and practices to ensure that fair across the board. So even just checking in, you know, on a quarterly basis, everybody get together, okay, over lunch, we're going to do that. And we don't want to see the rat on the shelf sitting there. It has to be a living document, like you said, Sammy. So, yeah, it's important.
That's right, Andy. And it's not easy to do it. And I guess what I would really hone in on here is that if you don't have First Nations people involved in developing the policies and procedures, or involved in developing your RAP or your First Nations action plan, if you don't have people involved with lived experience involved in this work from the beginning, it can feel really daunting and overwhelming. So I guess the other really critical part of this is make sure you've got First Nations people involved from the get-go. Don't bring us a plan and say, can you just check this and sign off on it? Because I can tell you, not here and not for years, but I have been asked to do the tick and flick at the end. And there is nothing worse than looking at something and thinking, I can't see myself in any of this. You know, who wrote this? So it's important that you've got a First Nations perspective, not just across your policies and procedures, but from the beginning. What does this mean for those people, and what do they want to see? What do they think success looks like? Because it can be difficult if you're sitting in a silo and you haven't done this work before, or you're not a First Nations person. It can be difficult to try and conceptualise what the right thing to do is, and that's when I think this work can feel most overwhelming. What are the next steps? Well, who have you asked what the next step should be? What are the actions around creating cultural safety? Well, how do you know that you've reached cultural safety? Who are you asking? Because you can't declare that your organisation is culturally safe. The only people who can decide and determine cultural safety are First Nations people accessing your organisation in some way, whether that's clients or staff or volunteers or board members. At no point can an organisation say, hand on heart, we are culturally safe, because that's not how this works. And what feels safe for me might feel completely different for Andy, because we're from different contexts. So it's important that we're doing this work in a really consultative and collaborative way.
Yeah. And just acknowledge the richness that we bring in the workplace as well. And any guidance, we're more than willing to share and advice and show that we can provide a culturally safe environment in the workplace as well. So don't ever be ashamed to ask, because there's no silly questions when it comes to safety.
That's exactly right, Andy. And I think one of the things that has come up for me a few times is organisations or managers who are a bit reluctant to continually go and ask their staff for advice or ask, for input on cultural matters. And it's important that we just pause for a second and reflect on that, because I really recognise the value that is in being mindful around those things, about being mindful of the load that you're asking people to bring. There is a cultural load that First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people bring to the door every day. Andy, I'm sure you get it too, but we all get the Facebook messages at night and the calls at 7 and 8 o'clock night saying, "Sis, we don't know what to do. This has just come up. Can you help us?" Or, you get stopped in the grocery store, and that doesn't matter whether you've been in the organisation and you've grown up in community and you're working in community now, or whether you're just known as a First Nations solicitor, or you're known as somebody in the organisation or in the sector who can help. There is a load that we carry after hours. And so I'm really mindful that there are some managers who want to make sure that they're doing this consultation and doing this in a collaborative way that doesn't also add to people's load. And there's ways that we can do that in a respectful way. The first thing that I would do would be to ask your staff if they would like to be involved, and let them and give them the space to say yes or no. And if they don't, that's totally okay. There should be nothing wrong with somebody saying, "Actually, I don't feel comfortable doing it," or "Actually, I just don't have the energy or the time at the moment." And if somebody says, "Yes, I would really like to be involved," carve out time for this work rather than expecting them to carry a full caseload, as well as managing your RAP processes. So there's ways that we can carve out time for people and space for people in a really respectful way that also acknowledges the fact that they don't need to be involved in this work. And if they don't want to be involved in this work, perhaps we need to consider having some kind of reference group or somebody external to the organisation that you can go to. There's aunties that I know of down in the southeast corner who are phone a friends for lots of the managers and the CEOs in our sector, who have really willingly put their hands up and said, "Actually, I would really love to help you." And so talk to your staff about their level of comfort. Don't assume that people are willing and able to speak on behalf of First Nations peoples. There's lots of different experiences in terms of identity and cultural knowledge. Some people have been really blessed to have grown up with lots of culture, and other people didn't have that same opportunity for lots of reasons that can be seen throughout history, and without saying colonialism and racism too many times in this webinar, but we just need to be mindful of the different experiences of people. So ask your staff if they want to be involved. If they do, carve out time and space for them. And if they don't, that's totally okay. They might have somebody else who's willing to help. And if you don't have relationships with people outside of your organisation, now is absolutely the time to start building those. Andy is usually happy to take a call from me no matter how many times I call her, and I'm very grateful for that. And there's lots of people in our sector who have really willingly put their hands up and said, "Yeah, I'm really happy to help. Please call me."
Yeah, right.
So the next piece about responsibility and moving on from embedding in the organisation is who is responsible for this work. It's not the First Nations employees and the First Nations clients who are responsible for building cultural safety in this, but it is also not just a responsibility of the board and the CEO. So we've got here a bit of a visual map of where it sits, and it absolutely starts at the top. If you don't have cultural safety embedded in your governance work or in the highest levels of your management, if you're not a not-for-profit, then it absolutely will not work. We need champions and we need leaders to be pushing this work from the top so that we don't have this huge rush of energy from the people in the organisation who are doing this work on the ground and on the front line, but no support from management. So it's really important that it starts at the board, that it's filters down to the CEO, that CEO empowers their management team, that the management team are empowering and giving resources and energy and time for this work to their staff and volunteers. And it should be driven by First Nations peoples as well. So we need to work really collaboratively and also be really mindful of what we're asking of people. So it can't just be the board and it can't just be staff. It needs to be a really collaborative effort across the organisation. If it's not embedded in your governance and it's not embedded in your management, then it's not going to be embedded in your service delivery no matter how hard we try. So we spoke before about reporting, and that's absolutely one part of it. Do you have a cultural safety action plan or a First Nations action plan? Do you have a RAP? There's lots of different versions of what this looks like, but you choose what works for your organisations, I guess, but make sure that whatever it is that you've got is embedded and that it's informed by First Nations people. So how do we create meaningful and transformational change? And that transformational change word comes from Auntie Margaret down here. I've done a lot of work with her and she's absolutely one of my favourite humans, and she always talks about how do we create impact, and she says, how do we do this in a transformational way? This can't just be business as usual, and she's absolutely right, she always is, but particularly on this, you can't create meaningful change without understanding your why, which we spoke about at the beginning. This work absolutely must be people-centric. It needs to centre the unique experience of First Nations people. They need to be involved, and it has to address the systemic issues in a proactive and really holistic way. So how do you embed equity over equality? Are you connected to community? What does transformational change mean? Because, again, there's lots of these kind of high-level buzzwords, but not a lot of practical ways of implementing this kind of work. Do you have a relationship with First Nations people outside of your organisation and in your community? And when I say community in a place-based way, that can sometimes feel really obvious. Do you have your local connection to your health, so the Aboriginal Health Services or the Aboriginal Medical Services, or do you have local relationships with your elders groups or with your ACOs? Do you have warm referral pathways? So in a place-based way, sometimes that can be really obvious, and that's what we mean by community. But in terms of community, for me in particular, being from New South Wales and living up in Queensland, community has a really broad meaning for me. And it is the people in my world that I know that I can call. So in your organisation, who do you know that you can call? Do you have somebody that you can phone to say, this is what's happening and I need some advice, or what do you think? Do you have a reference group the way that Community Legal Sense Queensland does? Do you have something or somebody in a way that means that you have reciprocal relationships into your community? Because without relationships, you're not going to be able to do this in a meaningful and transformational way. And relationships need to be ongoing. It can't just be that you invite your local elders group to the NAIDOC morning tea that you're hosting and you expect them to turn up. It can't just be that you come to the local NAIDOC or the reconciliation breakfast and you set up a tent. Have you reached out to your local ACO or Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisation to say, how do we support you? We know that you're here, we know that we're here, how do we work together? What is it that we can do for you? And that's the way that relationships start. It can't be you coming with your hand out and saying, we really need some help, can you help us? Or we have this client that we need you to take, or how do we make sure that you've already got those relationships in place so that when you do find times when your organisation has a client that they need to support or has work that they're trying to do, that the relationships are there, and the relationship is the work. Do you want to add anything to that, Andy?
Just to continue just what you're saying, you know, seek out your traditional owners or your historical owners, elders, you know, respected people in the community, and ask for advice. Use what you have around you all the time. We know better about our community. We know better about the families. And if we don't, then we go and obtain, that advice from the respected elders or the respected persons in the community. So don't think that you've got to deal with an issue on your own. Always use what's around you. The contacts within your community are your greatest asset as well, both for First Nations and non-First Nations.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that Murray grapevine is strong, so if we don't know, we'll find someone who does.
Yep,
and so I guess this next part is about knowing where you're going. So these are just some questions for you to ponder. We won't spend too much time on this piece because you can answer them for yourselves, but do you have a stakeholder engagement plan that outlines how many engagements you do per quarter and what you'd like to get out of them or what you'd like to give as part of them? Do you have a RAP or a First Nations action plan? Do you know the level of cultural safety in your organisation? And if you do, how do you know and how do you continue to measure it? Do you have a recruitment and retention plan for First Nations staff and volunteers and your board members? Do you have an identified position on your board? And if you don't, are you at a position where you are culturally safe enough as an organisation to have an identified member? Because bringing one person onto your board is not going to fix this issue. Does it include procedures on how to ensure a culturally safe environment beyond putting flags and artwork in your reception area? Do your management report their performance based on the First Nations Action Plan or RAP? And does your CEO report to the board on this work? And again, we've touched on that stuff a little bit, but just to kind of reiterate that there's some of the things that you can start to implement in terms of practical steps and strategies. And the last slide before we get to questions is organisational strategies that you can help to guide your work. There's reporting, measuring, prioritising, workforce, support and community. And we pulled this slide together based on lots of conversations that we've had. There'll be lots of different pieces of other organisations in here that you might see similarities to, and that's because this work is really ongoing. It's transformational, it's quite fluid, and I like to make sure that I really acknowledge this is not just something that I or Community Legal Centre Queensland have created. So in terms of your reporting, we've been through that a lot. That's the far left, and you'll get a copy of these slides. In terms of measuring and evaluation, know where you're going. And I guess a big part of that is what data do you already collect? What data do you have? What do you need to know that you don't already know? Have you thought about what impact you actually want to have? Have you thought about the way to bring people along in your organisation? And have you thought about co-design? And that's not a buzzword. It actually is a lot harder than people might think in terms of genuine co-design. So make sure you're really clear about whether this is consultative in terms of your process or whether it is genuine co-design. What data have you got and what do you need? Prioritising. Have you got a cultural safety plan or a RAP? And if you don't, you probably should. Do you have an employment strategy? Do you have an engagement strategy? Do you have governance and leadership positions in place? And how do you make sure that you're prioritising cultural change if you recognise that in your organisation there is actually a fair bit of work to do, or even a little bit of work to do in terms of your cultural change? How do we go about prioritising that work, recognising that change management takes time and it needs to be done in a strategic and thoughtful and supportive way? In terms of your workforce, do you have identified recruitment? Do you mandate supports for your employee like we spoke about at the beginning? Do you have flexibility in place around your leave and about what hours your staff can and can't work? And that will be determined based on whether or not you've got clients and all of that kind of thing. So we need to be mindful when we talk about flexibility. There is obviously limits to what we can implement in each organisation. But are you doing what you can to be flexible and to support your staff? Do you have ongoing cultural training? Do you have policies and procedures in place? In terms of your support, do you have EAP? Do your staff have access to EAP? Recognising it's not always culturally safe. And if they're not going to access EAP, what else can we put in place? Can we allocate the same kinds of time and energy and resources for the support that would be given to EAP to psychological supports or whatever they choose, or other supports that they choose? At Community Legal Centres Queensland, we run a First Nations employee network event called One Year. We've run that for the last 2 years, where it's free for all of our First Nations staff. We bring them together for 2 days of workshops, and that's not just professional skills building, but it's also filled with lots of really beautiful cultural activities and learning and sharing and yarning and lots and lots of laughs. Actually, it's difficult to get people back on track, but are you creating an environment where your staff feel like they can be themselves, and are you creating opportunities for them to fill their cups back up? Do you have cultural supervision in place? Do you have professional and personal development? Do you have mentoring available? And are you making staff do that in their own time, or is there a way that you can embed this into their usual time? Do you have decompress time? Are you allowing staff who work frontline, particularly First Nations staff, are you building in time for them to decompress? And are you recognising their cultural load? And the last one is community, which is probably a whole webinar on its own, and we might think about doing that. But do you have individual relationships? Do you have community engagement? Do you have partnerships, recognising that partnerships are useless without relationships? At no point should you go down to your local Aboriginal medical centre and say, hey, we want to do a partnership. If you don't have a relationship, if you don't know who the CEO and the front desk is by name, you probably shouldn't be asking them about partnerships. Let's get really genuine about building relationships first. Let's get genuine about putting people first. Can you just support existing groups and events? Because First Nations people absolutely know what their community needs, and they're probably already doing it. Can your organisation lend resources and support to that? How are you including self-determination principles? And how are you looking at collaboration and power? If you're from a big, wide organisation, how are you breaking down the power imbalance between you and your local Aboriginal corporation or your local group or whoever it is that you're trying to build a relationship? Make sure that you're mindful of the power. And we might look at breaking down some of these for a different webinar, because I'm really conscious that there's lots to absorb in there. And hopefully this slide is really helpful for people being able to use it as a starting point to say, well, actually, we don't have any decompressed time, or actually, we don't have any employee support. Maybe we can start there. Actually, we haven't thought about how we quantify how many engagements we do. And that's not just going to an event. That can be setting up a coffee. It can be just coming down and having a conversation. It can be as simple or as sophisticated as you need it to be. It needs to fit the context. And we've been doing lots of talking. And before I let anybody else talk, Andy, do you want to add anything else? Is there anything that you want to talk about? Obviously, we've been really kind of organisational focused, but yeah.
Yes, I mean, sorry, just to comment on that last slide. It is a really good slide for a starting point, and it gives people a lot to really think about, because I can tick here, tick there. Oh, gee. So it's a really good slide on how do we get there, and continued reporting as well. But yeah, no.
And I guess this webinar about building cultural safety into your organisation doesn't go as much into the mindfulness around. You did an absolutely incredible conference session for us this year on your experience, but also the experience you co-presented with Auntie Flo about the impacts of colonisation on First Nations people. And you spoke beautifully from your personal perspective. So I guess the other thing that this doesn't cover and could not have covered in the hour that we've got is being mindful of the past traumas and the current traumas that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people suffer and have suffered since colonisation. So that's a whole other topic, and I don't want people to feel like, hey, they didn't cover any of that. And I guess we've been really mindful that we've only got a certain amount of time. And we've probably got time for a couple of questions if anybody's got something burning that they want to pop in the chat that I hopefully have not missed, but might have. So one of the questions that came through, Andy, you might want to have a go at this, is what do we do first? What's our starting point? After listening to all of this, where would you start?
I would certainly, you build the relationships, get to know those people in your organisation, meaningful sitting down. And as you said, be mindful of the past traumas and the current traumas that people are going through. Just give people time and respect. We've all of us has a story to tell. So I think it's important to put those bricks down the bottom first and build those relationships up. You get a fair idea of people after you've started talking with people. So I think that's the very first thing, is know who you're working with, know who's around you, and start building those relationships.
Yeah, I think that's where I would start too. There's nothing that can happen without a relationship. And if you are in Queensland or in the legal sector, or even outside the legal sector, and you're not quite sure where to start, you're absolutely welcome to get in touch with me. And if I don't know, then I'll definitely go to Andy. And if Andy doesn't know, she can ask everyone else. But if you don't have those relationships, there's no way that this work can be done in a simple and meaningful way. That's as easy as it gets. I think you need to build relationships.
Yeah.
And there's another question here about whether or not we would recommend a RAP or a cultural safety plan or an action plan of some kind. And I wouldn't recommend that. I would ask you to speak to people in your organisation about what they would prefer. I have my own pretty preferences about how things are implemented, but it depends too much on your context. You do need to have one or the other. If you want both, that's great, but you do need to have one or the other, because if this work is not done in a planned way, it can feel really hard and really floundery, I guess, and really quite piecemeal, and it needs to be strategic and it needs to be structured in order to be safe. So I wouldn't recommend one over another. Outside of personal opinions, I think it depends too much on your local context and who's in your organisation. So I would go back to building relationships and then make your decision from there. And there's no other questions that have come through yet. If you do have any other questions that you would like to ask, I'm mindful of the time and just want to say thank you so much to Andy for making some time and finding enough reception on Palm and making sure that you're here outside of all of your other commitments and all the other hats you wear. I'm so...
Thank you, Sammy, and thank you to everybody that's attended as well.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. We will make sure that this is all recorded. It has been recorded. I promised Leah in our organisation that I would press record, and I did. So that's great. We'll make sure that we get the recording and the PowerPoints out to you by the end of the week. Before you go, I'll remind you that there is a bit of a feedback survey that will pop up on your screen once the webinar is closed. And your feedback helps us to continually improve our webinar program, particularly if there was pieces in here where you think, look, I really like the webinar, but I really want to know more about this. The more information you can give us, the more we can help. So whatever we can do to help support and scaffold this work we really want to do. This is a bit of an intro 101 to cultural safety, but we are happy to help in any other way that we can. If you do have specific questions, you're welcome to come to me, or you're welcome to come to Andy as well. I'm going to nominate you, Andy. So make sure you do the feedback survey. There's nothing else from us in terms of what needs to happen next. So I just want to thank everybody again, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.